Hi, this is Andrew from Unitarian Apologetics. Welcome to the Gospel of John, a Unitarian commentary. This is part 4, John chapter 2. Today we're going to look at the wedding at Cana where Jesus turns the water into wine. And then we will see if we can understand better what Jesus is saying when he tells the religious authorities, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. So the first thing to note here is that this is the first of 7 signs that Jesus does in what's often called the book of signs, which is John chapter 119 through 1250. Later, John chapter 13 through the end of the gospel is what's often called the book of glory. And the first thing we want to note here was pointed out by C.H. Dodd again in the interpretation of the fourth gospel. He says, like most of John, quote, this story is not to be taken at its face value. Its true meaning lies deeper. We are given no direct clue to this deeper meaning, as we are for some other signs. It must be sought from a consideration of the general background of thought presupposed in the first readers. And so we're going to look at 3 main areas where we might be able to gather some background context so that we can understand what John is saying here a little better. The first place we're going to seek this background context is from the Old Testament and Intertestament expectation of the eschatological or end times abundance of wine. Then we'll look at the replacement fulfillment theology that we're seeing here in John 1 and 2. And lastly, we'll look at an excerpt from Philo, which brings a strikingly similar parallel here with John's gospel, where Melchizedek brings forth wine instead of water to Abraham. So before getting into this Old Testament and Intertestament background expectation of an abundance of wine, I like this excerpt from the Collegeville Bible Commentary on page 984. It says, with this account, located in the small town of Cana, north in Galilee, John begins his signs theology. The question, as always in John, is what does this sign mean? In this instance, the meaning is multiple, but it is centered on one basic point: the arrival through Jesus of the new messianic age. What is changed in this incident is not simply water, but water for Old Testament ceremonial washings. It is changed not simply into wine, but into wine of the highest quality and of surprising quantity. Such a superabundance of wine was a frequent prophetic figure of speech for the dawning of the messianic age. And she cites Amos 9:13 through 14, Joel 3:18, and then states the symbol was current also at the time of Jesus, as we read in the almost contemporary Second Baruch 29. And so let us read some of these verses and books which she has cited. First, she cites Amos 9:13, which reads, behold, the days are coming, declares Yahweh, when the plowman will overtake the reaper and the treader of grapes, the sower of seed. The mountains will drip with sweet wine, with which all hills will flow. And Joel 3:18 reads, and in that day the mountains will drip with sweet wine, and the hills will flow with milk. All the streams of Judah will run with water, and a spring will flow from the house of the Lord to water the valley of acacias. And this passage in Second Baruch 29, 5 through 8 is also very interesting in comparison with what we read in John's gospel. It says, the earth also shall yield its fruit 10,000-fold, and on each vine there shall be 1,000 branches, and each branch shall produce 1,000 clusters, and each cluster produce 1,000 grapes, and each grape produce a core of wine. And those who have hungered shall rejoice. Moreover, also they shall behold marvels every day, for winds shall go forth from before me to bring every morning the fragrance of aromatic fruits, and at the close of the day clouds distilling the dew of health. And it shall come to pass at the selfsame time that the treasury of manna shall again descend from on high, and they will eat of it in those years, because these are they who have come to the consummation of time. And so these ceremonial jars used by the Jews were most likely for washing their hands and various utensils according to ceremonial laws prescribed in the Old Testament Mosaic law. But here we're going to see a deeper significance revealed through Jesus, where he is fulfilling or replacing these ceremonial laws with a deeper revelation and understanding from God. C.H. Dodd says concerning the ceremonial jars that, quote, they stand for the entire system of Jewish ceremonial observance, and by implication for religion upon that level, wherever it is found, as distinguished from the religion upon the level of aletheia. Thus, the first of signs already symbolizes the doctrine that the law has come through Moses, but grace and truth has come through Jesus Christ. And lastly, we're going to look at an interesting and almost similar portrayal again here from Philo in what he says about Melchizedek with what we read in the fourth gospel. In his book, The Allegorical Interpretation, Book 3, 79 through 82, he's speaking firstly about the Ammonites and the Moabites and how they were refused entrance into the assembly of the Lord because they did not come out to meet the Israelites with bread and water when they came out of Egypt. And then in line 82, he says, but Melchizedek shall bring forward wine instead of water. And so the first thing we notice is that in Genesis 14, in this account of Melchizedek and Abraham, there's no mention of wine being brought out instead of water. Melchizedek simply brings out wine and bread to Abraham. And so what Philo's done here is he's interpolated these two passages. Of course, the Exodus happened much later than this account here in Genesis 14. And so let us keep reading. He says, but Melchizedek shall bring forward wine instead of water, and shall give your souls to drink, and shall cheer them with unmixed wine, in order that they may be wholly occupied with a divine intoxication, more sober than sobriety itself. And so when we seek to understand this, if we read the Gospel of John on a sort of literal level, we're going to see Jesus as almost wanting to get everybody really drunk with this literal wine, but there is a deeper significance of what's being said here. And so let's keep reading. He says, for Logos is a priest, having as its inheritance the true God, and entertaining lofty and sublime and magnificent ideas about him, for he is a priest of the Most High God. And so Philo is actually presenting Melchizedek as the Logos here. And so Melchizedek is the Logos here for Philo, but also the Logos itself is the wine which Melchizedek is bringing forth, which is exactly what we see in the Gospel of John, where Jesus is presented as the Logos, but also brings forward the Logos which comes from his Father. So next we'll see if we can understand a little better about what Jesus is saying in John 2:19 when he says, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." So here in the Gospel of John, just like in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus has done what's called cleansing the temple of these money changers and those selling doves. And here in John's account, we read, "So the Jews answered and said to him, 'What sign can you show us to prove your authority to do these things?' Jesus answered and said to them, 'Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up.'" And later in that same account, we read he was speaking concerning the temple of his body. And so I found two major hangups that we run into when interpreting this verse. And the first is the question of who is it that actually raised Jesus from the dead? Because all throughout the New Testament, we read that God raised Jesus from the dead. And here it appears that Jesus has raised himself from the dead, if that's indeed what he's saying here. And so Trinitarians will say essentially that, well, God raised Jesus from the dead. Now Jesus has raised himself from the dead. Therefore, Jesus is God. But we have to make sense of what's being said here and reconcile those two facts. The next question is of how is Jesus's body the temple, and what exactly is being said here? Are we to take this as Jesus's actual body literally being the new temple? Let's explore that a little bit more. So, concerning the first question of who is it that raised Jesus from the dead, again, all throughout the New Testament, we read that somebody other than Jesus has raised Jesus from the dead. The God of Jesus has raised Jesus from the dead. For instance, in Acts 4:10, Jesus Christ, whom God raised from the dead. And again, in Romans 10:9, God has raised Jesus from the dead. And even explicitly here, in case there's any ambiguity about who God is, in Galatians 1:1, we read explicitly that God the Father has raised Jesus from the dead. So, unless we want to say that Jesus is the Father and now has raised himself from the dead, we're going to have to try to reconcile these two facts. And to clear up any confusion, in John 10:17-18, Jesus says himself, "The reason the Father loves me is that I lay down my life in order to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down myself. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it again. This commandment I have received from my Father." This authority that Jesus has been given to lay down his life and also to take it up again is an authority that was given to him by his Father, who is his God, who is the only true God in the Gospel of John. But I still don't think that we should quite take this at a literal level as much as we should seek to understand what Jesus is saying theologically here. And so let us go a little bit further and seek to understand how Jesus's body was the temple, if indeed that's what's being said. What we see in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, in the same scenario where Jesus is cleansing the temple, it says, "And he declared to them, 'It is written, my house will be called a house of prayer.'" And so he's citing Isaiah 56:7 here when Yahweh is speaking, who is the God of Jesus, and saying that my house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers, citing Jeremiah 7:11. But an interesting thing happens in John 2:16. Jesus goes further than that and says, "Get these out of here. How dare you turn my Father's house into a marketplace?" And so the house of God is equivalent to the temple. And so this simple formulation, house of God equals temple equals the Father's house. So whether it's the literal temple or Jesus being the temple, this is still the housing of the Father. This is a place where the Father manifests and reveals himself. Later in the Gospel of John, in chapter 14, verse 2, Jesus says, "Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house, there are many mansions." So he makes a mention again of his Father's house and says, "And if it is not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you?" And so it makes no sense if Jesus is literally being called the temple here, if he's also going to his Father's house, which is the temple also. And so when we read Hebrews 9:24, for Christ did not enter a man-made copy of the true sanctuary, but he entered heaven itself, now to appear on our behalf in the presence of God. Again, if we take Jesus as literally being the new temple, we would say something like the temple has entered into the temple. So we have to reconcile that and make sense of it. So the best explanation I've found that satisfies the meaning of this text is by George Beasley Murray, again in the World Biblical Commentary. He writes, quote, "The risen Lord is the place where the glory of God is revealed, where his forgiveness and renewal are experienced, and where fellowship with God is grounded and forever maintained." And so Jesus is replacing the temple as the locus of these activities. So essentially, we could say the risen Lord is the place where the glory of God is revealed instead of the earthly temple, and where his forgiveness and renewal are experienced instead of the earthly temple, and where fellowship with God is grounded and forever maintained instead of the earthly temple. And so I like how he says that the risen Lord is the place where the glory of God is. And so that clears up a lot of confusion about what's being said and continues our replacement fulfillment theology that we see with Jesus replacing now the earthly temple. Instead of seeing Jesus as being a literal new temple, we should probably just see it as the place where these activities occur instead of the earthly temple. On the next episode, we're going to be exploring John 3 and Jesus' interaction with Nicodemus, where he speaks of ascending and descending and also being born again or being born from above. Until then, God bless.